Selfish lady. Once upon a time, there was a woman named Grace. She was a selfish woman who cared only about herself and her own interests. Grace was born into a wealthy family and had never known anything other than a life of luxury and privilege. From a young age, Grace had always been focused on herself. She would often take her toys away from her siblings and refuse to share anything with anyone else. As she grew older, her selfishness only grew more pronounced. She became obsessed with her appearance, spending hours each day getting ready and buying expensive clothes and jewelry. Despite her selfish nature, Grace was quite charming and had a way of getting what she wanted from people. She had a large group of friends, but they were all superficial relationships based on what they could do for her. She never bothered to help anyone else or give back to the community in any way. As Grace entered adulthood, she became even more self-centered. She landed a job at a prestigious law firm, but only used it as a means to make more money for herself. She would often take on cases that she knew were morally questionable, just because they paid well. Grace's relationships with men were also very selfish. She would date men for their money and social status, but never cared about their feelings or well-being. She would dump them as soon as they were no longer useful to her. One day, Grace met a man named John. He was handsome, successful, and came from a wealthy family. Grace was immediately drawn to him and saw him as a potential way to further her own interests. She started dating him and they quickly became serious. At first, things seemed to be going well. John was attentive and seemed genuinely interested in Grace. However, as time went on, Grace began to realize that John was not as wealthy as she had thought. He had inherited some money from his family, but he was not nearly as wealthy as Grace had hoped. Grace became increasingly distant from John, realizing that he was not going to be able to provide her with the kind of lifestyle she wanted. She started seeing other men behind his back and eventually broke up with him, telling him that she needed someone who could give her more. John was devastated by the breakup and couldn't understand what had gone wrong. He had loved Grace and had thought that she felt the same way. He tried to talk to her and work things out, but Grace was not interested. She simply saw John as a means to an end and had no interest in him as a person. After the breakup, Grace continued on with her selfish ways. She dated wealthy men and took on questionable legal cases. She never bothered to give back to the community or help anyone in need. Her friends began to see her for who she really was and slowly started to distance themselves from her. One day, Grace's father became very ill. He had always doted on Grace and had given her everything she ever wanted. Grace was devastated by the news and rushed to his side. However, as she sat by his bed, she realized that she had never really appreciated him for who he was. She had always seen him as a means to an end, just like she had with John and so many others. As her father lay dying, Grace realized that she had wasted her life pursuing material wealth and selfish desires. She had never formed genuine relationships or done anything meaningful with her life. She was filled with regret and wished she could go back and do things differently. After her father's death, Grace began to make changes in her life. She started volunteering at a local charity and giving back to the community. She began to form genuine relationships with people and realized that there was more to life than just material possessions. As time went on, Grace became a different person. She was still